Today, we're diving deep into one of humanity's most ancient and really profound questions. What's right and what's wrong?
Yeah, the big ones.
For millennia, these foundational concepts were pretty much the exclusive territory of philosophers and spiritual traditions.
Right, that was their domain.
But lately, we're seeing this, truly revolutionary shift.
Yeah.
Thinkers are increasingly turning to science, asking, can the scientific method actually give us objective answers about morality?
It's a fascinating pivot, isn't it? And incredibly timely. And, one of the most prominent figures really leading this charge is Sam Harris.
Yes.
He's really trying to forge a path sort of between rigorous scientific inquiry and those deepest moral dilemmas we all face.
His groundbreaking work on this is The Moral Landscape, and he makes a truly bold claim in it. That science can objectively answer questions about right and wrong. How? By measuring something universal human well-being and conscious experience.
It's a huge claim.
Now, on the surface, that sounds revolutionary, but also, frankly, almost unbelievable. Can you truly put a number on human happiness? Is Harris taking a leap into pure fantasy, or is there some, serious substance behind his vision?
That's precisely the core question we're exploring today. And for this deep dive, our main insights are coming from Jorge Pires, PhD. Specifically, his critical articles, you might have seen them. Can we really mathematically describe human happiness? Is Sam Harris out of his mind?
Quite a title.
And also, morality and ethics. How come Sam Harris seems to ignore their distinction? Both were published in Scientists Free from Religion.
Okay, good sources. And it's probably important to clarify right up front that Pires isn't just, dismissing Harris entirely.
No, not at all. He actually shows a lot of respect for Harris's ambitious goal, this idea of establishing a secular morality grounded in human well-being.
Right.
He even seems to understand the impulse, the need perhaps to simplify really complex philosophical concepts to make them clearer for a broader audience.
Okay, so he sees the appeal.
Precisely. Pires acknowledges the powerful utility of Harris's approach, especially how it tries to bypass religious dogma and cultural relativism. It aims to ground morality in something universally understandable. However, Pires argues that Harris makes what he calls a fundamental conceptual oversight.
A fundamental oversight. Okay, so our mission today is to really unpack Harris's visionary project, but also understand exactly where Pires argues it might be, incomplete.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be focusing especially on why Pires' critique about the distinction between ethics and morality is apparently so crucial for getting a complete picture. So let's start by laying out Harris's vision. What exactly is he trying to build here?
Good place to start. Harris is pushing for an objective understanding of morality and value. His belief, essentially, is that a completed science of the mind could ultimately understand them.
A completed science of the mind.
Wow. At its heart, his work is really an attack on relativism, directly challenging that widespread idea that objective measurement of different values is just, impossible.
And it feels incredibly relevant right now, doesn't it? I mean, the idea of trying to quantify happiness or well-being isn't totally new.
Sure.
You had Jeremy Bentham's hedonic calculus centuries ago, or today we talk about gross national happiness metrics.
The surveys and things.
But in this era of big data, neuroscience, AI ethics even, Harris's proposal to build a kind of moral calculus based on scientific fact just feels profoundly now.
It absolutely does. And one of his key conceptual moves to build this foundation is what he calls the worst possible misery for everyone.
Okay.
This is Harris's anchor point, his undeniable baseline. He asserts the self-evident badness of an absolute perfect hell, where every conscious being suffers as much as they possibly can for as long as they possibly can.
Grim stuff. Like the hot stove analogy you mentioned.
Exactly. If you put your hand on a hot stove, it truly sucks.
Yeah.
That's not just, cultural convention or personal preference.
No, it's real pain.
It's a universal objective experience for any conscious being.
Okay, so that establishes a floor, a baseline of badness.
That's right. If that's the absolute worst, then any movement away from it is, by definition, incrementally better. This establishes a baseline for objective moral truths. Now, a crucial distinction Harris makes here, one Pires pays close attention to, is that we can make epistemologically objective claims about ontologically subjective facts.
Whoa, okay. That sounds like a bit of a philosophical tightrope walk. Can you unpack that for us? What does epistemologically objective about ontologically subjective facts really mean for understanding something like pain or joy?
Sure, let's break it down. Think of it like this. Ontological subjectivity refers to your private, felt experience, the specific feeling of your headache or your joy. It exists only inside your head, your subjective consciousness.
Okay, my personal feeling.
Right. Epistemological objectivity, on the other hand, is about getting dispassionate, unbiased knowledge, using scientific methods to reliably track the truth about those subjective experiences. So while your headache is undeniably subjective to you, it is an objective truth that you're subjectively experiencing suffering. And we can measure that objectively maybe through brain activity scans or looking at how it impacts your concentration.
I see.
The insight here is that Harris is trying to bridge that gap between our private feelings and what science can universally measure. He's saying your pain is real, and its badness can actually be a scientific fact.
Got it. So the experience itself is personal, but the facts about that experience, its existence and effects, can be observed and measured scientifically. That's a powerful move. And how does he handle words like ought and should? Those seem so tied to traditional morality.
Yeah, that's a really interesting part. Harris takes a unique stance on words like ought and should, those sort of traditional moral commands. He basically says, look, we don't need some mystical external duty or intrinsic moral law.
Okay, so what do they mean then?
For him, you should do X just means doing X is the most effective way to move towards well-being and away from suffering, given how human minds and societies actually work.
So it's about effectiveness.
Exactly. He gives an example. If there was a button that could reduce human misery by half at absolutely no cost, he argues, we really should push that button. Why? This isn't about imposing some non-existent duty. It's about describing the optimal navigation on what he calls the moral landscape.
The moral landscape. That's his big metaphor, right?
Yeah.
This kind of conceptual space with peaks of well-being and valleys of suffering.
That's the one. He describes it as a conceptual space that contains all possible ways humans can flourish or suffer. The peaks represent optimal well-being, maximum flourishing, while the valleys are states of misery, the worst suffering.
And science helps us navigate.
Science, in this view, acts as our map and compass. It guides our decision-making towards better outcomes, towards climbing those peaks. So it's almost like Harris wants to treat morality as an engineering problem.
An engineering problem. How so?
Well, think about it. Like a team designing a bridge to be as strong as possible given certain constraints, Harris envisions us engineering society to maximize human well-being given all the real-world limitations. It makes morality feel incredibly practical, doesn't it? Something you can actually work on.
It really does. So Harris lays out this incredibly ambitious scientific framework for morality. Makes it sound almost like a solvable problem, almost mathematical. But I understand Pires sees a fundamental crack in this foundation. What's his core argument? What's Harris overlooking?
Pires argues that Harris's primary oversight is his tendency to treat ethics and morality as if they're basically the same thing, interchangeable.
Okay.
Pires insists this isn't just semantics, like arguing over words. He sees it as a fundamental conceptual oversight that risks oversimplifying complex philosophical debates and glossing over cultural differences.
So Pires is saying there's a vital distinction between them. How does he define them? What's the difference?
For Pires, think of it this way. Ethics is the deep dive. It's the reflective philosophical inquiry into why we believe something is right or wrong. It's the underlying principles, the justification. It asks, what makes our moral code valid? Sort of the meta-level thinking.
Okay, so ethics is the why, the theory. What's morality then, according to Pires?
Morality for Pires is what people actually do and believe is right in their everyday lives within their communities. It's the specific set of rules, customs, and practices that guide behavior within a specific community or culture at a given time. And crucially, it's descriptive and contingent. It changes a lot across different cultures and even across different periods in history.
Right, like what was considered moral 200 years ago might be very different now.
Exactly.
And what's the big danger, the big consequence of mixing these two up, of conflating ethics and morality?
Pires argues it risks conflating culturally relative practices with universal normative principles. Harris might apply a universal ethical standard, like maximizing well-being, to judge a specific local practice, a moral practice, without clearly acknowledging that these operate on different conceptual levels. He's sort of applying the general theory directly to the specific practice without marking the shift.
Can you give us a concrete example of this conceptual flattening, as Pires calls it?
Yeah, Pires uses Harris's example of condemning the practice of preventing women from reading. Harris, quite rightly, condemns this as morally wrong, By appealing to objective well-being, it clearly causes suffering and limits flourishing.
Okay, makes sense.
Pires absolutely agrees with Harris's conclusion denying education is wrong, but he points out that Harris treats this particular morality, the judgment against preventing reading, as if it were universally fixed, like an unchanging ethical law. Pires contends Harris neglects to acknowledge that morality, as lived and experienced, is deeply plural and situated. It varies. So this conceptual flattening mixes universal ethical claims, well-being is good, with critiques of specific contingent moral practices. This community's rule is bad, without clearly separating the two levels of analysis.
That distinction really helps clarify Pires' argument. It's subtle, but important.
Yeah.
Beyond this definitional issue, what other limitations does Pires identify in Harris's scientific approach?
Well, another big one Pires points to is what he calls the unacknowledged normative premise.
Normative premise.
Yeah. He argues that Harris's entire system, despite its claim to scientific objectivity, ultimately rests on a fundamental assumption that conscious well-being is the supreme moral value, the ultimate good.
And Pires says that's not science.
Right. Pires insists this premise, valuing well-being above all else, is an ethical choice, a value judgment, not a scientific fact discovered in a lab. Science can describe well-being, measure it maybe, but it can't tell us that well-being ought to be our ultimate goal.
This sounds an awful lot like Hume's famous is-ought problem, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You can't logically derive an ought, what we should do, purely from an is what is the case.
Exactly right. Pires argues that Harris's powerful analogies, like the moral landscape or the hot stove, cleverly present empirical facts. Suffering exists, stoves burn, as if they automatically generate the ought. We ought to avoid suffering. We ought to maximize well-being. He argues Harris sidesteps the need for that prior ethical commitment to valuing well-being. That ought is a starting point, a value choice, not something science itself provides.
Okay, and how does Harris's universal landscape handle the sheer diversity of moral beliefs we see across the world? Does it account for that?
Pires argues it struggles to. He brings up findings from the moral machine experiment. You might remember that big MIT study about ethical dilemmas for autonomous vehicles.
Oh yeah, the trolley problem, variations for self-driving cars.
That's the one. Global participants revealed really diverse moral preferences. For instance, priorities like saving younger versus older people, or humans versus animals. These varied significantly depending on cultural background.
Interesting.
So Pires poses a critical question. If machines programmed with morality must shift their ethical choices by country, how can Harris's universal moral landscape account for such pluralism? It strongly suggests that morality, as practiced, is deeply embedded in cultural contexts, which really complicates a purely scientific, universal, objectivist approach.
So different cultures might have different peaks on the landscape, or maybe even define the peaks differently. What else might get missed if we only focus on quantifiable well-being? Are there important things that just don't fit that metric?
That's another key point Pires makes. He contends that Harris's reduction of morality to measurable well-being might inadvertently exclude other critical ethical dimensions like dignity, autonomy, integrity, and meaning.
Things that are harder to put a number on.
Exactly. These values are arguably central to human experience but resistant to straightforward quantification. The danger, Pires warns, is that sidelining these could diminish the richness and responsiveness of ethical inquiry. It could potentially lead to conclusions that feel technically optimal in terms of well-being units, but clash horribly with other deeply held ethical intuitions like, say, sacrificing individual rights for just a slight overall increase in the group's happiness score.
Okay, that's a really powerful critique. It paints a picture of an ambitious, maybe even elegant system, but one that might overlook some crucial nuances, some human depths. But Harris, I assume, has responded to some of these points. How does he elaborate or defend his vision? What about that point that his whole system rests on the brute fact that well-being is good?
Harris definitely pushes back. He argues that all intellectual endeavors, even hard sciences like physics and mathematics, have to rely on certain brute facts or axiomatic starting points that aren't in themselves self-justifying.
Like basic assumptions you just have to accept to get started.
Precisely. He asserts that denying the inherent badness of the worst possible misery is fundamentally irrational. It's akin to pretending to think that all squares are really round. For him, this foundational agreement on extreme suffering is the philosophical bedrock for moral truths, just like axioms are the bedrock for mathematics. You have to start somewhere.
He also mentions a kind of double standard in how we treat moral truth versus scientific truth. What's he getting at there?
Harris argues there's an inconsistency. When, say, a creationist challenges the very definition of physics, scientists don't suddenly throw up their hands and question the validity of physics itself.
Right, they defend the science.
But, Harris points out, if the Taliban's alternate morality is presented, people often get hesitant. They start questioning if our morality is better or more true. Harris insists we are actually in a position to judge practices based on their outcomes. Why? Because we know a lot about human well-being. We know how practices like his examples, veiling women or denying them education, demonstrably cause suffering and limit flourishing. The science of well-being gives us grounds for judgment.
So for Harris, the objective facts about well-being give us the right, even the obligation, to make those judgments. But the question Pires raises still lingers. Why should we care about others' well-being? If my suffering is objectively bad for me, why does your suffering necessarily matter to me morally?
That's a crucial point. Harris emphasizes that humans are fundamentally deeply social creatures. So much of what makes life good, what constitutes well-being, is born of your entanglement with other people.
Our connections matter.
Exactly. He says we naturally want to interact with people who are filled with joy and creative energy, not misery and stagnation. He uses the provocative example of an arms manufacturer who claims to enjoy war. Harris would argue that person is likely cognitively closed off to some of the most beautiful spots on the moral landscape. They could, potentially, be happier in a world where he doesn't have to make bullets.
Even if the arms dealer doesn't think so.
Right, and even if we can't persuade them through reason, Harris suggests we might sometimes need to brute force it using laws, perhaps even imprisonment for the greater good. We can see their actions as immoral when viewed from above, that is, from the broader perspective of overall conscious well-being for everyone.
That brings us to another really fascinating aspect of Harris's work, how he connects well-being not just to external conditions or brain states, but to the direct, subjective experience of consciousness itself, often through practices like meditation or even using psychedelics.
Yes, exactly. This is key for him. He sees conscious experience itself as a crucial domain for understanding well-being. He talks about states like selflessness or non-duality, achievable through practices like meditation.
What does he mean by those terms?
He describes it as an impersonal state of consciousness where the usual sense of subject-object separation drops out. You don't feel like a separate self looking at the world, there's just experiencing. This sense of freedom, he argues, provides profound tranquility and can be the antidote to all kinds of ordinary psychological suffering.
And this relates back to objectivity.
Yes, because he views this as an objective truth about subjective states. It's epistemologically objective, we can understand and describe this state, about an ontologically subjective fact, the feeling of selflessness. This direct experience for Harris reinforces the core idea that there are objectively better and worse ways for a conscious mind to be.
Interesting. And how does this relate to things like religion?
Well, while acknowledging the utility of religion, providing community, purpose, maybe even useful rituals, Harris suggests that secular alternatives, grounded in a real understanding of consciousness and well-being, could potentially provide these benefits too, possibly better in the long run because they're in touch with real truths that are not divisive. He even entertains ideas like useful fictions, like believing in heaven if it truly led to maximal well-being, though he's skeptical, and dangerous knowledge, like a readily available smallpox recipe, judging them all within this overarching framework of maximizing overall conscious well-being.
Wow. Okay, we've really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. It's absolutely clear that Sam Harris's ambitious project to sort of naturalize morality, make it scientific, is visionary. But, as Jorge Pires argues pretty compellingly, it also seems, well, incomplete.
Incomplete is a good word.
It really demonstrates the inherent complexity, the difficulty of defining right and wrong, even when we bring powerful scientific tools into the discussion.
Precisely. And Pires really hammers this home. He reiterates that Harris's intentional dismissal of the ethics-morality distinction, that's step one, then the failure to recognize normative premises, the is-ought gap, and finally, the insufficient engagement with cultural pluralism. All these things, Pires argues, serve to limit the explanatory power of his model.
So the elegance and the simplicity that make Harris's model appealing.
Exactly. That elegance comes at a cost. Pires suggests it sacrifices crucial nuance and philosophical depth. It's like, as you said, trying to simplify a really complex, multi-layered problem by just focusing intensely on one layer, the measurable well-being layer, and maybe missing others.
So for you listening, we really encourage you to be critical consumer, when you encounter these kinds of powerful arguments about the nature of morality, especially now. With things like AI ethics becoming so critical, we literally have to try and code values into machines. Ask yourself, are concepts like ethics and morality being used interchangeably? What might be lost if they are?
Yeah, and is well-being being presented as the only truly important value? Or are things like dignity, autonomy, justice, meaning, are they also being considered, even if they're much harder to quantify? What are the underlying assumptions being made? Are they being presented as discovered scientific facts, or are they actually fundamental value choices someone has made?
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. As you think about our collective moral journey, especially as science gives us more insights, how do we best integrate these cutting-edge scientific findings about well-being with a genuine recognition of our incredibly diverse human values and cultural practices?
Does acknowledging that distinction Pires highlights between universal ethical aspirations like reducing suffering and diverse cultural moralities, the specific ways people live, does that allow for a more nuanced, maybe more respectful, and ultimately a more productive dialogue about how we ought to live together? Keep questioning and keep diving deeper.